Hello, hey guys, my eschatology cohort group. It's good to be sending this video to you guys. Sorry I can't be there during the bulk of our time of presentations. It's just so hard to nail down a time when it's the last couple weeks of the school year. Everybody is getting so busy. But I thank you guys for taking the time to watch this, and I can't wait to watch and see what you guys are presenting. Here in this video, I'll be discussing the idea of idealism as an interpretation, or as a form of interpretation for the book of Revelation. So if we look at it, my thesis behind this is I want to show that idealism is the most logical way to interpret Revelation. It makes the most sense out of the ways. So first I'll give a quick explanation of what idealism is. Idealism is the concept that Revelation should be read highly metaphorically. There's very little about Revelation that's meant to be read 100% literally, and even the very literal parts, such as the beginning, the letters to the churches, and even at the end, the the letters or the message about Christ's final judgment and the second coming and the restoration, healing, and restoration of Christ. Even those parts, there's some metaphors laced in there as well. It's a highly metaphorical interpretation of Revelation. The other three major views would be the historicist view, which has not been popular in the last several hundred years. That's the idea that all the events of Revelation are literal and they take place across history. So an event would happen and they would tie that event together with something in Revelation, something in apocalyptic literature and scripture, and they would tie those in. Then there's the futurist view that takes that virtually everything after Revelation 3, which is the 3 chapters with the letters to the churches, basically everything after that point is literal and will happen sometime in the future. And that's had its ebbs and flows and ups and downs of popularity throughout time. And then the last view is the preterist view, which is that almost everything has already been fulfilled. That Revelation was written in the 60s AD, and that in 70 AD, with the fall of Jerusalem, so many of the things within the book of Revelation became fulfilled and took place. Mostly the beasts and the tribulation, and all the 7 seals, 7 bowls, things along those lines. That those were fulfilled during that time. During that time of the fall of Jerusalem, there's very little only at the end of the book with the restoration and second coming and new heavens, new earth, final judgment. That's the only thing that really still has to come. Everything else has already happened for the most part. So those are kind of the major concepts we're looking at. Yeah, that's what idealism is. Revelation. An idealist mostly sees Revelation as the first 3 chapters are covering the 3 churches, and there are 3 literal churches that they're writing to, but even those 3 churches are highly metaphorical, and they're representative and symbolic of the churches, of every kind of church. Every kind of church that can happen in the Christian age matches up with one of those 7 churches. Those 7 churches are symbolic of the kinds of churches we will have, that we will see in our own lives, that we might experience, we might be a part of. We might be part of the leadership of one of these churches, and we can look at the words from John, the words from Jesus through John in that, and see what our church is looking like in that apocalyptic literature, in that somewhat metaphorical way. And then the middle chapters of basically 4 through 19 or 20 are covering the trials and tribulations that will happen cyclically in every church age, and often in the life of every believer. They'll face their own antichrist, their own false prophet. They'll have their own tribulation in church ages and in the life of a believer. And then it becomes much more literal, but still with metaphorical elements when you get to the end of the age, with second coming and final judgment. Prominent figures of idealism. The major one is, people like to refer to Augustine as one. Augustine was a pretty prominent amillennialist. He did start as a premillennialist and then moved into amillennialism. And while idealism wasn't, the phrase wasn't around at the time, his reasoning behind transitioning from transitioning from pre-mill to on-mill was that he used to read Revelation very literally. Oh yeah, this is going to happen at the end of the age. And then, as he became more experienced later in his life, he kind of came to, oh no, this is much more metaphorical. This is much more interpretive. I should move out of thinking that this is all literal in the future. Maybe it is stuff that will happen cyclically over time. And you move to an on-mill perspective that the millennium is currently happening throughout the age. Other prominent figures of amillennialism would be John Calvin and Martin Luther. Amillennialism is the major interpretation of the end times, the major view of the end times, that somebody who has idealistic interpretations of Revelation will hold to. So John Calvin and Martin Luther have a lot of elements of idealism, as well as Karl Barth, more in the modern day, still not modern day, but much closer to our modern day than those other guys. So there's pretty big name scholars that would adhere pretty strongly to idealism. So it's not without support of some scholars and some theologians over time. One major benefit of idealism is that it doesn't necessarily have to stand alone. It can have elements and it can match up with other things. It doesn't have to stand firm as just, oh, idealism. Idealism's here. Idealism can be paired up with preterism pretty well. That's becoming much more popular. As Kenny has told us, preterism is the idea, again, that Revelation was fulfilled in 70 AD. So some people will believe that, yes, most of Revelation was fulfilled for the first time in 70 AD, and now it'll be occurring cyclically over time again in the life of every believer and in every church age until Christ comes back in that final judgment in the second coming. So you can match it up with preterism, or it can be matched up with futuristic interpretation in a way of, okay, these are things that are happening cyclically over time, and then they will be fulfilled at the very end with these things, and then it'll all happen again. So you can match it up. It can stand by itself, but it can also stand with other views as well. So I also wanted to dive in then and look at some scriptures and discuss why an idealistic interpretation of these verses makes the most sense as compared to other views. Revelation 1:3. This is right at the beginning. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. For the time is near. That's when John is introducing the book. And he uses that phrase in 1:1. He uses the phrase, these are happening soon. Here he says the time is near. And some people would read that and be like, okay, well, the end times are about to happen. A preterist would say, oh, it's about to happen in 70 AD, versus a futurist would say that these things are, oh, the end times are coming any minute now, versus an amillennial would say, yeah, they're happening soon because they're happening right now. They're currently occurring. We're currently in the millennium. These things are all happening among us, happening around us right now. Revelation 7:4, jumping ahead a little bit, and I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. Then it continues on to list out all the tribes of Israel and the 12,000 people that belong to each of them. There's a lot of discussion and even argument on who the 144,000 are exactly. An amillennialist or an idealist would mostly say it's representative of the body of Christ. It's representative of believers. The listing the 12 tribes of Israel, it's representative of the spiritual Israel that is living and alive, the spiritual Israel that is church today, the church. Let's look at Revelation 11:1 and 2. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar of those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. These verses talk about the temple, that an idealist would say the temple is just representative of the church and how the church is always struggling and always having division there, and it needs to be checked. And there's going to be 42 months where it's attacked, and that's all interpretive. It's all metaphorical of the church being divided and being attacked and persecution. And there, while a preterist would say 42 months, yep, 70 AD, versus a futurist would say 42 months, there will be 42 months in the future. An idealist can say one of those could be also true, but it's also very much a cyclical thing that is currently happening. Is the church is divided, the temple of Christ is divided, because the temple is in us now. Revelation 13, 16 through 17. Also, this is speaking of the beasts. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. Those verses speak of the number of the beast. Oh, I skipped a section. Sorry. Revelation 13:18. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Again, there's a lot of interpretation, a lot of discussion and argument on what 666 means. A futurist will say something 666 is going to happen in the future. Preterist, again, will look at 666s. That's numbers that add up to Nero. Historicist will have somewhere around there too, some interpretation in there. A lot of people would say Nero 666. An idealist would say it could be Nero 666, could also be something in the future. But 6 is also the number that represents brokenness and represents the opposite of wholeness, incompleteness. And that's why 666, it just represents that the beast itself, the number of the beast that's controlling you, is simply incompleteness and turning away from the Lord. Revelation 13, 16 through 17, I already read those verses, speaking of the mark of the beast, and then immediately it juxtaposes with Revelation 14:1. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000, we get that 144,000 again, who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So you see here in Revelation 13, the beast has his number, his mark written on the foreheads of people. And then Revelation 14, the Lamb on Zion, who has his name and his father's name is written on the foreheads of the 144,000, the great multitude of believers, the church. And it's just simply juxtaposing. An idealistic view would say that is it's showing that when you're chasing after the world, when you're chasing after evil, you're being controlled by it. That's what's on your forehead. Versus the spiritual Israel, the spiritual 144,000, that's a metaphorical number. Those people have Christ written on their forehead. They have the Father's name written on their forehead because they're showing that their thoughts and minds are influenced by Christ alone. Revelation 18, 2 through 3. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable heart. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sin, her sexual immortality, and the kings of the earth will have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. This is talking about Babylon falling, the fall of Babylon. These angels are telling John about this. There's different views. A preterist would say the fall of Babylon is Jerusalem itself falling. A futurist would say there's going to be a great nation that rises up. Many would say Babylon itself is going to rise up again and then we'll have to fall. Versus an idealist can simply look at that and say that's cyclical. There's been many evil nations that have risen up over time and fallen, and risen up and fallen, and risen up and fallen. And you can look at that. Nations that have given themselves away to sexual immorality and luxurious living and all kinds of sins, drunk with wine and passion, all these kinds of things, detestable hearts, unclean spirits, all of these things. Nations around it have experienced these things a lot over time, and it's a cyclical thing that there are many Babylons. There is a Babylon in a church age. There's Babylons that the life of a believer, you'll face a Babylon in your life. That's a major idealistic view of that. It makes a lot of sense. It's a very logical interpretation, and it doesn't take it. You're not taking either extreme. You're simply saying, no, this is true, and it's very true. It's meant to be read as to you and as the believer. Revelation 26. I'm gonna get a sip of water real fast. My voice is getting a little raspy. Revelation 26. This is the verses on the millennium. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. Mm. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. That's incredible because brothers and sisters, I guess sisters in this group, that's us. We are those who share in the first resurrection, and we will reign with him for 1,000 years. And that's not speaking of a literal 1,000 years. Based on all this evidence, based on the interpretation of the idealist interpretation of Revelation, we can see that 1,000 years is speaking of a church age that's currently happening, stuff that's currently happening in the life of us, the church. So we are currently reigning with Christ for that 1,000 years. It's not something that's yet to happen in the future. It's something that's currently happening. We're currently experiencing in that reigning ourselves, and the amillennial view comes to light in there. So I hope you guys can see there the amillennial or the idealistic view, how that kind of carries through the book of Revelation and then even into the millennium there at the very end. It makes sense. Oh, this is it. And then it even goes into verses, I mean, talking about the second coming and then the final judgment and the new heavens, new earth. And there's interpretive, metaphorical things in there as well. But those, even an idealist, even a hardcore amillennialist would say those things are still coming in the future. So I thank you for listening to this discussion on idealism. I hope it's impacted your thinking or maybe simply just refreshed and yeah, I've repeated things that you've heard and thought about, and it gives you a chance to think about it once again. Hope I've brought something new to the table for you to chew on, for you to think about. So, thank you so much, guys, and have a wonderful day.